Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
As she said, welcome to the fourth day, but the first Sunday of Christmas. You know, for most of us around the world, Christmas is over. It is done. But if you lived at my house, you would know that it is just starting. Believe me, when I first got married, I was a little in shock when the entire Christmas season, there wasn't a single sign of Christmas. Why? Because my husband was the son of an Episcopal priest. Did I know? No clue. I grew up Baptist. Like, how am I supposed to know that you don't do Christmas until Christmas Day, right? Such a different life. Yet, it was really the beginning of like 12 solid days of celebration. On January 1st was my husband's mother's birthday, and on the 5th was his birthday, so it's been just one big 12-day party at my house. And yet, you know, it's not just about Christmas. It's really about all the work we do to prepare in the time of Advent. And it is during these days that we begin to understand and ponder and think and make room in our hearts for the idea that Jesus is coming. And in fact, on the 24th, we find Jesus is coming, and then he's born, and then suddenly he's here. But what exactly does that mean? What does that mean in our chaotic world full of turmoil? Has that presence made a difference in you? Has it made a difference in me, in us, in our presence in the world? Does it matter that he is here? And then really, who is he? And who are we in the light of Christmas? So when I read today's gospel, I thought, well, I really had two thoughts. The first one was, score! I scored the best gospel reading ever this whole year. And then my second thought was, how in the world did John come up with such a profound, meaningful, deep, simple, and beautiful theological thought? How did he get there? Maybe he spent years after Christ's death, resurrection, and ascension thinking about the same question. How did the presence of Christ make a difference in the world? Who is he? And who are we in that light? So I did a little research. I looked at the first sentence in every gospel. Matthew, this is the record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. A little boring, right? Mark, he just starts right in. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Again, a little boring. Luke says, now many have undertaken to complete an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, blah, blah, blah. But what happens with John? He shouts out, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That's a lot of shouting. Clearly, he'd been thinking a little bit about that question. Who is Jesus? And who is John? So I started thinking about, well, who is John? The earliest traditions of the church are fairly aligned that John, the author of the gospel, was actually the younger brother of James, the son of Zebedee. There are lots of scriptures in the whole Gospel of John where he speaks in the first person, as though he were actually there. You know, he was actually first a disciple of John the Baptist, but the moment he met the Messiah, he dropped that guy and went after Jesus, right? He also describes himself, you might recall, as the beloved disciple. He was the one who was leaning on Jesus' shoulder at the Last Supper. And it's interesting because in that same moment, Jesus had just portrayed that he would be betrayed by someone in the room. And Peter motioned to John, who was leaning on Jesus, and said, hey, since you're sitting next to him, why don't you ask him? And John writes about himself. He says, since I was sitting next to Jesus at the table, being his closest friend, I asked him. You can kind of hear this personality coming out. Interestingly, the Zebedees were actually a family of a decent amount of influence in Judea as well. We know it was John who got admittance to Pilate's court when Jesus was there being questioned by Pilate. At the crucifixion, it was John who was entrusted with the care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. And John himself writes in the gospel that he bore witness, that he actually saw that when they pierced the side of Jesus, that blood and water came out. He saw it with his own eyes. Interestingly, on Sunday morning, you might recall after Mary had the experience of the resurrected Jesus, they ran back to the disciples, and John says that he outran Peter back to the tomb, got there, but looked in, but didn't go in. And then after Peter went inside, John went in and stated, he has risen. So tradition says he was the first of all of us to believe in the resurrection. Later at the Sea of Galilee, after the disciples went back to fishing, couldn't catch a thing, and somebody said, hey boys, try the other side of the boat. And they did, and their nets were full, and they looked to the shore, and it was John who told Peter, it's the Lord. And then in the very last chapter of John's gospel, we see this other story where Jesus is telling Peter what kind of death he's going to die. It's an interesting data point, right? But what does Peter do? He looks at John, he says, and what about that guy? How's he going to die? And Jesus says to Peter, if I want him to live until I return, what is that to you? You follow me. So John goes on to tell us that went around the village and became a rumor that he was never going to die. And then he corrected it. And he says, that disciple was me. That was me. I saw these things and I recorded them here. And we all know that my account is accurate. Literally, that's what the gospel says. It is actually the tradition that John was likely the youngest of all the disciples that followed Jesus and walked with him. And they also place him as the author of the book of Revelations. In fact, he was the only disciple who died of natural causes. All the others died as martyrs. And they say that he died in the year 100 AD at the age of 93, 94, after having been exiled on the island of Patmos. We know from Acts that he ministered with Peter to both Jews and Gentiles, and an entire community built up around his message and his witness. So I think maybe it's because he lived so long that he had time to think about these deep theological thoughts. He had some core messages for us. Jesus is the eternal word. He is the creator. He is the great I am. Of all the books in the New Testament, his gospel stands apart. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they tell the basic story. They tell stories, they tell the history, they provide a portrayal of Jesus that's very grounded. But John soars. His language is poetic, his theology is bold, and his perspective is unique. Many of the scholars say his is the spiritual gospel. And they start from the beginning. They say, it's interesting. He didn't start his gospel from Bethlehem or Nazareth or Jerusalem. He started his gospel from all eternity. And by design, he meant for all of us and all the people who were his contemporaries to hear the alignment of the first chapter in Genesis together with these words. He wrote, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being, and Genesis says. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was without shape and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the watery deep. But the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water. In the writing of the Gospel of John, we hear Jesus in that moment. And again, John said, what has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. That light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. And in Genesis, we read, in the beginning, God spoke the word and said, let there be light. And there was light. So for us, the Gospel of John is not just his biography, not only the biography of Jesus, but it is a profound theological reflection on who Jesus truly is and what his life meant, not just for them, but for all believers through all time. And it really does explain who we are and who he is. So that answers the first question, who is Jesus, right? Now the second question is, who are we? This is the question we're left with. John writes the answer in the same passage. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. And from his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, but grace and truth through Jesus Christ. So who are you? What is your identity? Actually, Ted and I were talking about that just a moment before service started. I thought, isn't that funny? In many ways, we all answer that question. Well, I'm a doctor. Well, I come from, the Mondavi family. Or I live in St. Helena. Or I love and am an active cyclist, right? We fill that answer with all these other things, our relationships, where we come from, our hobbies, how we see ourselves. But who are we really? So I asked myself that question too. So who am I? It's interesting because I come from a really large family. And we are actually like the 14th generation American. Now, if you're counting, there aren't very many generations in America. So we're kind of here from the beginning. And my family is huge. On my mom's side, I'm the second oldest of 17 cousins. And I got another, parcel of family on the other side. I was very blessed because I knew my aunts and uncles, my great aunts and uncles, my great great aunts and great great uncles. Our family followed the history of the United States. We have embarrassing slave owners in our family, some very famous malfeasant characters. We also have lots of pioneers who came out and covered wagons in the West, my grandfather being one of them. I grew up in the country with that rich heritage. I know my family had lots of faith. We have stories of people who experienced great accidents and pleaded with the Lord, Jesus, if you'll only save me from this moment, I will serve you the rest of my life. And they did. A rich legacy of faith. Grace upon grace. Now in our generation, our cousins, our grandparents themselves, even some are great-grandparents. It's amazing, right? They got started earlier than I did. But it's time as each generation passes, for us to celebrate and be grateful for who we are and that grace upon grace. John, too, was a family that was transformed. He built a community of people whose lives were completely transformed. They had seen and heard that man who forgave every sinner, who healed the sick and raised the dead. He rose from the grave. And they were willing to risk everything in their lives to tell the whole world about Jesus. According to John, to follow Jesus is to walk in the light of life, to drink the living water, and to be reborn. And together, we are empowered by that knowledge, the community of John, and we are grateful. Again, the Gospel of John is the one gospel that talks about Jesus as God and makes all these great I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the resurrection and life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. That's who Jesus is. So the beauty of John 1 lies in its simplicity and depth for us and helping us understand who we are. Jesus, being the eternal Word, he is the one who spoke creation into being, brings order into the chaos of our world. Fortunately, John gave us the language to understand that, and really to understand the very mystery and essence of Christmas, the intimacy of divine love, and the audacity of receiving and believing. The followers of John risked everything to receive and believe Jesus. To say that John was the Son of God was to put your life at risk. And they did that. And because of their faithfulness, their grace, we have received grace upon grace. So when we feel lost or overwhelmed, we can rest in the assurance that his light shines in our darkest moments and nothing can extinguish it. John inspires us to take the risk of following Jesus and just to simply receive and believe. And when we do, grace upon grace is ours forever. Amen.